My brother got me fired from my first job. Then his company hired the CEO I became. The HR director slid a single sheet of paper across her desk and told me I had 20 minutes to clean out my workstation. Her name was Pamela Ingrid, and she had been in human resources for 14 years and had the particular practice neutrality of someone who had delivered this specific kind of news enough times that it no longer registered on her face in any meaningful way. Where the paper said termination of employment at the top and cited violation of confidentiality protocols as the cause. I read it twice. Then I read it a third time because the words were not connecting to any reality I recognized. I had been at Kellerton Financial Group for 11 months, had never missed a deadline, had never been written up, had received a performance review 6 weeks prior that my manager had described in writing, "Our is one of the strongest first-year showings in the department's recent history." I set the paper back on the desk carefully, the way you set something down when you are trying to demonstrate that you are in control of your hands. I asked Pamela Ingrid who had filed the complaint. She said she wasn't at liberty to share that information. I asked what confidential information I had allegedly disclosed and to whom. She said the details were in the investigation file, which was internal. I asked if I could appeal. She said I could submit a written appeal within 10 business days. Then she slid a box of personal items across the desk, items that had already been removed from my workstation by someone else, which meant this decision had been made before I walked into that room. And she gestured toward the door. I picked up the box. I walked out. In the elevator going down, I stared at the wall and thought about my brother. And the thought arrived with a certainty that felt less like suspicion and more like recognition. I need to explain who Noel is before I explain what he did, because the behavior doesn't make complete sense without the context of 17 years of being his younger brother. Noel Adeyemi was 31 when this happened, 4 years older than me, and had occupied a specific gravitational position in our family from the time we were children. The eldest son, Anit, the one who inherited our father's bearing and our mother's charm, the one for whom things came easily and who had never developed the patience for anything that didn't. We grew up in Silver Spring, Maryland, the sons of Nigerian immigrants who had built a small contracting business from nothing and who believed, with the specific conviction of people who had rebuilt themselves in a foreign country, that education and professional achievement were the primary currencies of a meaningful life. My father, Emeka Adeyemi, applied this philosophy with approximately equal force to both of us, but the results were not equal because Noel was 3 years ahead of me in school and therefore always the benchmark. He went to University of Maryland on a partial academic scholarship. He graduated with a finance degree. He got a job at a mid-sized investment firm in D.C. almost immediately after graduation. He was, in our parents' telling of the family story, the proof that the sacrifices had been worth it. I was the work in progress. I graduated from the same university 4 years after Noel, also in finance, and I got a job offer from Kellerton Financial Group, a wealth management firm with offices in D.C. and New York that was by any measure a more prestigious first posting than Noel's had been. My mother was proud. My father was proud. Noel, who had been working at his firm for 4 years by then and had recently been passed over for a promotion he believed he deserved, drove me to my first day of work and told me in the car that the firm had a reputation for burning through junior analysts and that I shouldn't get too comfortable. I told myself that was concern. I was wrong about that. The first sign that something was wrong came about 5 months into my job, in a form so subtle I almost missed it. I had been presenting at a junior analyst briefing, a monthly meeting where the newer staff summarized client portfolio performance for the senior team. And I had done well enough that the department head, a man named Gregory Odom, who had been in wealth management for 22 years and who communicated exclusively and clipped precise sentences that told you exactly where you stood, had pulled me aside afterward and said, "Good instincts on the Praxis Holdings. We need people who can read between the lines." It was the kind of specific praise that meant something at Kellerton, where compliments were distributed with the scarcity of rainfall in a drought. I called Noel that evening, not to brag, but because he was my brother, and I still operated under the assumption that my brother's interests and mine were aligned. I told him about the briefing, about Gregory's comment, about the Praxis Holdings analysis I'd done. Noel asked several specific questions: which client the holdings were connected to, what my recommendation had been, what data sources I'd used. I answered them all because he was my brother and because he worked in finance, and the questions seemed like professional curiosity. 2 weeks later, I mentioned to a colleague that my brother worked in the industry, and she went pale in a way that was confusing, and then recovered and said something vague about keeping work conversations in the building. I didn't understand what she meant. I filed it away. I told myself it was nothing. I was wrong about that too. The second sign was a conversation I was not supposed to hear. I had stayed late on a Wednesday in April, finishing a client analysis that was due the following morning. During the floor had emptied by 7:30 p.m. to the point where I was one of 3 people remaining on the 18th floor. I went to refill my water bottle at the kitchen at the far end of the hall and heard voices in a conference room whose glass panels had been left slightly ajar. The voices were Gregory Odoms and a man I recognized as the firm's chief compliance officer, a serious, angular man named Douglas Farr who had been at Kellerton for 11 years and who made people nervous without doing anything specifically menacing. They were speaking in the controlled, careful register of people who thought they were alone. I heard Gregory say a client name, one of the clients I'd worked on. I heard Douglas say the word leak. I heard Gregory say something about an inquiry from a competing firm that had made a very specific move on an asset they should not have known about. And the specificity suggested inside information. I stood in the hallway outside the conference room for about 4 seconds, heart doing something I could feel in my throat. And then I walked quietly back to my desk and sat down and stared at my screen for a long time. I told myself this had nothing to do with me. I told myself the timing was coincidental. I finished my analysis and went home and lay awake until 2 a.m. While thinking about the specific questions Noel had asked me 5 months ago and the specific asset Gregory had mentioned in that conference room. I want to be precise about what I did and didn't do in the period between hearing that conversation and being called into Pamela Ingrid's office 3 weeks later, because the sequence matters. I did not report what I'd overheard to compliance. And this was a failure of judgment I've spent time examining with the particular discomfort of someone who knows they should have moved faster. But I was 27 years old and 11 months into my first professional job, and what I'd heard was fragments. A client name, the word leak, an inference that I was constructing from separate data points. And I was afraid that raising a concern based on what I'd accidentally overheard while getting water at 7:30 p.m. he would read as either accusatory or paranoid. I also didn't confront Noel for reasons that are harder to articulate and easier to feel. He was my brother, and the thing about family is that it produces a sustained gravitational pull toward benefit of the doubt that persists long past the point where the evidence warrants it. What I did do was stop discussing work with him. I stopped taking his calls during work hours. I started being careful about what I said when I saw him. If he noticed, he didn't mention it. 3 weeks after I heard the conference room conversation, Pamela Ingrid called me at 9:15 a.m. and asked me to come to her office immediately. The box of my personal items was already on her desk when I arrived. The investigation that preceded my termination, which I learned about in fragmentary, infuriating pieces over the following weeks through the employment attorney I retained, had been initiated by a complaint filed with the firm's compliance department. The complaint was anonymous. It alleged that I had shared non-public client information with an individual at a competing firm. The timing of a specific trade made by that competing firm was cited as corroborating evidence. Douglas Farr's compliance team had reviewed my communications, work email, phone logs from my office line, and found no direct evidence, which should have been exculpatory but apparently wasn't, because the firm's threshold for termination under their confidentiality policy was reasonable grounds for concern rather than proof, a legal distinction. My attorney, a woman named Bernadette Okafor, who had been practicing employment law for 16 years and who had the precise diction of someone who spent her professional life choosing every word carefully, described as appallingly low but unfortunately standard in financial services. Bernadette reviewed everything, the termination letter, the appeal process, the firm's policy documents, and told me that I had a plausible wrongful termination claim, but that pursuing it would require discovery that could take years and cost significant money, and that the outcome was uncertain, because the firm's documentation was carefully worded to give the maximum legal cover. As she said, "You could fight this and win, but I want you to understand what winning looks like in employment litigation, and I want you to decide whether that's how you want to spend the next 3 years." I asked her what the alternative was. She said, "You get another job." And you remember this. I got another job. I remembered this. Finding the next job took 4 months and was the specific kind of humbling that strips away professional identity in layers. Because in financial services, your reputation is your currency, and my termination, while not public, existed in the particular whisper network of a mid-sized industry where people knew people who knew people. I had 2 interviews where I could feel the interviewer's knowledge of the Kellerton situation in the texture of their questions. Slightly too careful, slightly too interested in my reasons for leaving, slightly too quick to say they'd be in touch before showing me out. And I had 3 interviews that went nowhere and one that produced a job offer from a smaller firm called Brentley Wealth Partners, which was a step down from Kellerton in prestige but had a department head named Alicia Soa, who had been in the industry for 20 years and who told me in our final interview that she'd done her own informal inquiry into my situation at Kellerton and had some thoughts about what had happened that she'd be willing to share once I was on staff. And I accepted the offer before she finished the sentence. Alicia Soa was a compact, watchful woman who had built her department from 4 people to 31 over 12 years, and who had a specific, hard-won understanding of how financial services institutions protected themselves at the expense of individuals. She sat me down in her office on my 3rd day and told me that Douglas Farr, Kellerton's compliance chief, had called her personally during her reference check on me, which was unusual, as reference checks were typically handled by HR, and had spoken in careful, technically neutral terms that nonetheless communicated a clear negative inference about my character. She said she had found this suspicious enough that she'd made a separate call to Gregory Odom directly, and that Gregory had been significantly less careful, and had said things that Alicia had written down. She handed me her notes across the desk. I read them twice. Gregory Odom had told her that there were questions about whether I understood professional boundaries, which was not defamatory, but was precisely targeted to destroy confidence in me within an industry where professional boundaries were everything. Alicia said, "Someone wanted you gone, and then someone made sure you stayed gone. That's 2 separate decisions." I already knew who had made the first one. I found the confirmation I needed 8 months into my time at Brentley. And it arrived through a channel I had not anticipated. A man named Kofi Mensah, who had been an analyst at Knowles' firm for 3 years, and who had started attending the same professional development network events I'd begun going to since my termination, partly because rebuilding a professional profile requires showing up to rooms where people can see you exist, and partly because I had nothing to lose by spending Thursday evenings at industry panels. Kofi and I met at a panel on regulatory compliance in November, the kind of event where you exchange business cards and make specific conversation because everyone present is calculating whether the other person is useful. He was sharp and observational in the way of someone who has learned to watch the people around him carefully, and over the course of 2 subsequent events, we developed the early architecture of a professional friendship. And in February, he called me and asked if we could speak privately, which was not something he'd done before, and we met at a coffee shop in DuPont Circle on a Saturday morning, where he told me, with the composure of someone who had been deciding whether to have this conversation for some time, that he'd heard something at his firm 8 months ago that he thought I deserved to know. He had been in a break room when 2 senior analysts, including my brother, had been discussing a client situation that involved a trade they'd made on a tip. The tip was described as coming from family, Knowles' word, according to Kofi. From family was the phrase he'd heard. He said he hadn't connected it to my situation until he met me at the panel event and looked up the timeline. He said he wasn't willing to go on record. His job, his livelihood, his visa status all lived inside that firm. But he wanted me to know. I thanked him. I paid for both coffees. I drove home with my hands completely steady on the wheel, which surprised me, because inside, I was not steady at all. I took what Kofi had told me, along with everything else I'd assembled over the previous year, to Bernadette Okafor. Her office was in the same building I'd visited 18 months earlier, but the conversation was different this time because the evidence was different. Not direct evidence. Kofi wouldn't go on record. And a second-hand recounting from a break room conversation was not the kind of documentation that made civil cases. But Bernadette was not thinking about a civil case anymore. She had made 2 calls while I was assembling my information, and those calls had been to a contact at the Securities and Exchange Commission's Division of Enforcement, and to a former colleague who now worked at FINRA, the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority. What I had told her, combined with what she'd found through her own research, described a pattern. A junior analyst at Kellerton had shared client information with his brother at a competing firm. The competing firm had traded on that information, the junior analyst had been fired to contain the situation, and then someone at the senior level of Kellerton, Douglas Farr's name appeared in her notes more than once, had made reference calls designed to ensure that the fired analyst stayed unemployable, which was both professionally malicious and potentially a separate legal matter. Bernadette said, "You were not the only leak. You were the cover for the actual leak. They fired you to close the investigation and pointed at someone expendable." I asked her what happened next. She said, "That depends on what you want." I thought about it for exactly 30 seconds. I told her I wanted the SEC to know what I knew. The referral process is not the dramatic confrontation of a courtroom scene, or it is paperwork and patience and a great deal of waiting in which you have to continue your regular life while a regulatory body moves at the pace of a regulatory body. I continued at Brently. I got better at my job with the specific focus of someone who has decided that their work is the thing that will outlast the damage done to them. Alicia Soa gave me more responsibility in stages. Either way a good manager does when they're watching someone grow into a role. First client management on smaller accounts, then a seat at the table for larger portfolio discussions, then, in my second year, a junior team of 2 analysts who reported to me. I was good at managing people in the way that people who've been treated badly by management often are. I understood specifically what not to do, which is more than half the job. I also enrolled in an executive MBA program at Georgetown, after night and weekend classes, which was brutal on top of the Brently workload, but which Alicia supported, and which I knew, even then, was not about the credential as much as about the discipline of proving to myself that I was building something that couldn't be taken away by a single phone call from Douglas Farr. The SEC investigation moved slowly, which Bernadette had warned me about. And when it surfaced in the press, it was not with my name attached. It was Knowles' firm that received the inquiry, framed as a broader look at trading practices. And Knowles' name did not appear in the initial reporting. My name appeared in none of it, which was both the point and a strange kind of invisibility that I had to learn to be comfortable with. Justice, when it comes through regulatory channels, does not typically give you the specific satisfaction of public acknowledgement. It gives you the cold comfort of process. The crisis that I hadn't anticipated came from a direction I should have anticipated but didn't, because it involved my parents, and I had made the mistake of assuming that what I'd been managing professionally had remained separate from the family system that had produced it. My mother called me on a Sunday afternoon in October, about 22 months after my termination. Dean and asked me if I'd done something to Knowles' career. Her voice had the particular tension of a woman trying to ask a direct question while hoping for a specific answer, and I knew from the first syllable that Noel had gotten ahead of me. He had called them, apparently, and told them that he was facing some professional difficulties related to a regulatory inquiry, and that he believed I had reported something to the authorities. He had framed this as betrayal. He had used the word family. My mother had absorbed his framing before she called me, which I understood and couldn't fully fault, because Noel had always been better at managing my parents' perception of him, and I had always been worse at it. And in any case, when the first call comes in and it uses the word family in that particular register, the listener tends to receive it as an alarm rather than as a data point to be weighed. I sat on my couch and I explained, but in the most precise terms I could manage without raising my voice, what had actually happened. I had been terminated from my first professional job based on a complaint that I now had significant reason to believe had been filed by Noel himself, or at his instigation, because he had used information I'd shared with him in a sibling conversation to make trades that benefited his firm. And when those trades drew scrutiny, he had pointed the investigation at me. I told my mother that I had not reported anything vindictively. I had reported what I knew to regulators because what Noel had done was illegal and because not reporting it would have made me complicit. My mother was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "He's still your brother." I said I knew that. I said it didn't change what he'd done. She hung up and I stared at my wall for a while, and then I went to bed and tried to sleep. What the SEC enforcement process produced, after 27 months of investigation, was a consent order. This is the regulatory equivalent of a settlement. No admission of wrongdoing, but specific penalties, restrictions, and in serious cases, bars from the industry. Noel's firm received a $2.4 million fine for inadequate supervision of trading activities, which was public information once the order was filed. 3 individuals at the firm were named in the order with varying levels of personal liability. Noel was one of them. His consequence was a 12-month suspension from working in a FINRA-regulated role and a $35,000 personal fine. Not prison, not the total destruction of his career. But his name was in a public regulatory document, in a paragraph that used the words insider information and failure to maintain appropriate information barriers, which in financial services is the professional equivalent of a permanent scar. His firm did not retain him after the suspension. The firms he interviewed with after could search his name in FINRA's public database and find the order. He struggled to find employment in the industry for 2 years. My parents did not throw him a celebration dinner. I want to be fair and say that last part is not something I felt simple satisfaction about. The complicated kind of feeling is harder to describe, and I'm still working through it in therapy with a man named Dr. Wole Adisa. a clinical psychologist who specializes in family estrangement and betrayal trauma, and who has told me more than once that the goal is not to not feel the complicated things, but to understand what I'm feeling and why. Bernadette Okafor called me the day the consent order was filed and said, in her precise way, "The record now reflects what actually happened." She did not say anything more dramatic than that, and I appreciated it. Because the dramatic version would have felt thin compared to the actual weight of what it meant. The record reflected what had happened. After 27 months of building a case, after 4 months of unemployment and 2 years at a smaller firm rebuilding from below where I'd started, after my parents' initial disbelief and the ongoing awkwardness of family holidays where Noel and I occupied the same space without speaking about any of it, after all of that, there was a public document that said, in regulatory language, that what I had known was true. I did not call Noel. I did not send him a message. I had said what needed to be said when it needed to be said, in the form of a regulatory report rather than a confrontation, and I had nothing to add to that. What I did do was call Kofi Mensah, who had left Noel's firm the previous year and was now at a boutique advisory firm he'd joined and was clearly happier in, and tell him the order had been filed. He said he'd seen it. He said he was glad. I told him the part he'd played in making it possible. He said, "You did the work. I just told you what I heard." I told him that mattered. It did. In the 4 years between my termination and the consent order, I had built something at Brentley Wealth Partners that was larger than I'd initially understood I was building. The executive MBA from Georgetown had finished, but the junior team of 2 had become a department of 9. Alicia Soa had moved into a strategic advisory role for the firm's parent company and had recommended me for a promotion that made me the youngest director in Brentley's wealth management division at 31 years old. I had a performance record over those 4 years that was, per the firm's annual review documents, exceptional. Client retention rate significantly above the division average. I'm on portfolio performance in the top quartile for my asset class, 3 new institutional clients I had sourced and closed personally. I had done this with the specific motivation of someone who understands that the only durable response to being underestimated and wrongly removed is to build something so clearly real that the removal itself becomes a footnote. I was not strategic about this in a cold way. The work was genuinely interesting to me, and I had found in those 4 years that I was good at building teams in a way I hadn't known before I had to do it. But I was also conscious every day that the professional story being written about me was the one I was writing myself now, and that the alternative story, the terminated analyst, the compliance question mark, was getting smaller in the rear view as the new one got larger. My father, who had said very little about any of it during the years of difficulty, he came to Brentley's annual client dinner in my 3rd year as director, at my invitation, and sat at a table with institutional clients whose names he recognized from financial news and watched me run a room of people who clearly respected me, and afterward in the parking garage said, in Yoruba, "You have become." It was the most complete sentence I'd ever received from him. Kellerton Financial Group reached out to me through a recruiter in March of my 5th year at Brentley. And I need to say this carefully, because the emotional response I had to that first call was not clean, and I want to be honest about it. My first reaction was not triumph. It was a kind of dissociative vertigo, the feeling of a timeline folding back on itself in a way that the brain's linear processing isn't equipped to handle smoothly. Hari, the recruiter, a man named Felix Ibarra, who had been placing senior executives in financial services for 14 years, explained that Kellerton was searching for a new head of wealth management, that the previous head had retired, that the firm had undergone significant governance restructuring over the previous 3 years, and that my profile had been identified as a strong fit. He said this without any indication that he knew my history with the firm, which told me either he didn't know or he did and had been instructed to proceed anyway. I asked him who on the Kellerton leadership team had authorized the search. He gave me 3 names. Gregory Odom was not among them. Douglas Farr was not among them. I did some research over the following week and confirmed that both men had left Kellerton, Gregory in the year after my termination, Douglas 2 years after that, under circumstances that FINRA's public database had something to say about. The restructuring Felix had mentioned was real and was deep. Kellerton was a different firm in leadership terms from the one that had put my personal items in a box and told me I had 20 minutes to leave. It was still the same building, same name, same carpet in the lobbies I'd walked for 11 months, but the people who had made those decisions were gone. I called Bernadette Okafor and told her about the recruiter. She said, "That's interesting timing." I said, "I knew." She said, "Are you going to take the interview?" I thought about it for 2 full days. I told her yes. The interview process at Kellerton took 8 weeks and involved 5 rounds with different members of the leadership team, including the CEO, a woman named Constance Yoon, who had joined the firm 3 years prior from a larger institution and who was, by every account I could find, someone who had been brought in specifically to rebuild the firm's internal culture and regulatory standing after a period that various industry profiles described as turbulent governance. Constance was 61, direct in the way of leaders who have stopped performing directness and simply are it. And in our second meeting, she said something that told me she knew more than her controlled executive manner suggested. We've done a thorough background review on you, and we've read everything. And I want you to know that includes things that may be uncomfortable to discuss. I told her I was comfortable discussing anything. She said, "You were terminated from this firm 11 years ago under circumstances that our current compliance team has reviewed and has some concerns about, separate from any regulatory matters. I want to know your perspective." I told her my perspective in the same measured, documented terms I'd used with every official who'd asked over the previous decade, what I'd shared with Noel, what I'd realized in retrospect, what the regulatory outcome had established, what I had done afterward, and why. I did not editorialize. I did not perform anger. I stated facts with the composure of someone who had been telling this story for long enough that it had settled into its final shape. Constance listened without interrupting. At the end, she said, "The person who filed the initial complaint against you was identified in our internal review 3 years ago. I can't share details, but I want you to know that the record here is clear about what happened." I nodded. I said, "I know." She said, "I thought you might." We shook hands and I left. 2 weeks later, Felix Ibarra called to offer me the position of Executive Vice President and Head of Wealth Management at Kellerton Financial Group. At a compensation package that I am not going to describe in detail here, except to say that it was the number I had told myself in the worst months after my termination, when I was eating cereal for dinner in a studio apartment and refreshing my email waiting for interview responses that I would one day be worth. I accepted the offer. I drove to the Kellerton building on my first day and parked in the executive garage and took the elevator to the 18th floor. The same floor where I had once sat at a junior analyst's desk and where I now had a corner office with a view I had not previously seen from inside that building. The department I inherited had 63 people, and I spent the first 3 months learning all of their names, all of their work, all of the reasons they'd stayed through years of leadership instability. I did not walk in with a restructuring mandate or a performance ultimatum. And I walked in with the specific understanding that the people who had stayed through difficulty were the people worth building with. And I had learned this from Alicia Soa and from Dr. Adisa and from the years of being the person on the other end of institutional indifference. I built the department into something that, within 2 years, was producing results that Constance Yoon described in a board presentation as the clearest evidence of the firm's cultural turnaround. I don't take sole credit for that. I had good people. But I brought something they hadn't had before. A leader who understood viscerally what it cost when institutions failed their people, and who had organized everything about his management philosophy around not repeating that cost. Noel and I spoke for the first time in a sustained way 3 years after the consent order, at our parents' 40th wedding anniversary dinner in Silver Spring. He looked older than I expected, which is a foolish thing to be surprised by, since I was also older than I'd been, but the particular aging was telling. Not the settled aging of someone who has made peace with their life's shape, but the compressed aging of someone who has been carrying something heavy. He had found work eventually, in a compliance consulting role at a small firm that worked with credit unions, which was about as far from the prestigious track he'd been on as you could get while still working in finance. He came to the dinner with a woman I hadn't met and sat at the other end of the table, and for the first 2 hours, we were polite and geographically separate in the way of people who have agreed, without saying so, to manage proximity through distance. Then, after dessert, when our parents were talking to their guests and the room had the warm, ambient noise of a celebration winding down, Noel came and stood beside me near the window. He said, "I heard you went back to Kellerton." I said I had. He said, "As the head of the department." I said yes. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I'm sorry. I've been trying to figure out how to say that to you for 10 years, and that's all I've got." I looked at him. He was my brother. The same brother who had driven me to my first day of work and told me not to get too comfortable, and I had once thought that was concern, and I had been wrong, and I had spent a decade being wrong about it, and then being right, and then becoming something that he had tried to prevent me from becoming. And here we were at our parents' anniversary dinner standing by a window in Silver Spring. I said, "I know you're sorry." I didn't say anything else, because there wasn't anything else that needed saying right then. Maybe not for a long time. Maybe the distance was the thing we'd live in for years yet. The shape our relationship had taken and might keep. That was okay. I could live in it. I'd lived in harder shapes than that and built a life anyway. I still have the box. The one with my personal items from my first termination, the one Pamela Ingrid slid across her desk 11 years ago. Most of what was in it has been discarded over the moves and apartment changes of a decade, but I kept one thing. A small print I'd had on my desk at Kellerton. A quote printed on cardstock that a college professor had given me when I graduated. Something about how the only way to make your work significant is to start it under the assumption that you will finish it. I kept it because in the months after the termination, when finishing felt genuinely uncertain, and I would look at it and make the decision again. Decide to finish. Decide to build. Decide that what had been done to me was real and wrong, and that the most powerful possible response was not rage, but continuation. The particular, relentless continuation of someone who has decided their story does not end where someone else tried to end it. That print is on my desk now at Kellerton, in the corner office on the 18th floor. I see it every morning when I sit down. Some days I don't think about its history. Most days I do. The building is the same. The carpet in the lobbies is the same. I am not remotely the same. And that, as it turns out, is more than enough. If you made it this far, you already know why this story matters. Hit like if you've ever built something in spite of someone who tried to make sure you couldn't.